Our scripture reading is from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. We're going to focus on towers of control and trust to communion. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there, and said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built, and the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. I always laugh. I typically laugh when I read that story because you see these people are so proud and they built this tower and they're excited and they are ambitious and there's a bit of ingenuity going on, and God looks down and he's like, "Oh, tornado." Just like, let's just ruin everything for him. And you get that sense when you read the story. And we've already looked in Genesis and understand that quite a bit of those first 11 chapters are mythopoeic in nature. They are reframed stories of the ancient Near East, and the story of the Tower of Babel is no exception. We noticed in looking at the creation story in Genesis 2 and 3 that it's poetry, and the tree of the life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, those were metaphors to describe for us the real struggle and choice humans have in deciding between two things that both appear to be good, that both appear to be worth having. We're not talking about literal trees and literal fruit. We're talking about two different types of human existence here and the ways in which we struggle to make the right choice between the two trees. One could argue that they already had knowledge of the trees and what they would produce because God told them what the fruit was, life or death. And there was nothing intrinsically wrong with them knowing things. Remember, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil also appeared to be good and desirable. It appeared to be worth having. Knowledge by itself was not the problem. There were consequences and the potential for wrong in applying what they knew, because all ideas have consequences. And they knew the consequences of eating from that tree because God told them, "In the day that you eat from this tree, you will die." They just didn't trust or believe that God knew what was best for humanity. And so it brings us to another type of story today that is similar to the creation story of Eden. Eden, if you will, is the microcosm. This is control versus trust on a personal level when we look at Eden. It's the belief that not only consuming an idea and knowing things, but applying one's own personal moral framework of good and evil to control others makes them wise and makes them like God. But the Tower of Babel is the macrocosm. This is a story of control versus trust on a national level when one group of people try to control speech in identity to the neglect of everybody else in society. Both paradigms result in exclusion and judgment and hold the possibility of turning your neighbor into somebody that you are to oppose, a rival, someone that you are to fight. And the story of the Tower of Babel is not just an origin myth to explain language diversity. This is satire. The Tower, the story of Babel, is satire. This is a theologically loaded ridicule of empire, pride, and human attempts to manufacture security and unity on their terms. And that's one of the most difficult things to understand about the story, because that context is not provided to us in the Bible. We have to know that there is a larger cultural, social, and historical context behind the story that is key to us understanding what it was intended to communicate to us about being human beings in the world. One of my favorite punk rock bands is Bad Religion. And they have an album in 1993 titled Recipe for Hate. And the guitarist Brad Gurewitz wrote a song called Skyscraper, expressing their take on the story of Babel in the Bible. And the chorus of that song is, build me up, tear me down, like a skyscraper, build me up, then tear down these joining walls so they can't climb at all. And then in the second verse, the band offers their understanding of why God destroyed the tower and scattered the people. The second verse is, I know why you tore it down that day. You thought that if you got caught, we'd all go away. Like a spoiled little baby who can't come out and play, you had your revenge. And then the bridge of the song is, well, madness reigned in paradise, drowned when Babel's walls came crashing down. Now the echoes roar of a story writ that was hardly understood and never any good. This is the band's interpretation of the story of the Tower of Babel, and to be honest, their initial take on the story is just as reasonable as anybody else's impression, because the only understanding that we're provided by looking at the Genesis story is they are one people. They have one language. They've got a goal in common here. Nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. That's the only reason we're provided in the text as to why they were scattered and confused and they gave off building the tower. There are some ancient Near Eastern parallels that are the historical setting for what we read in Genesis chapter 11. There was the ziggurat of Babylon. Etemeneke is the name of it, and this is the historical ancient Near Eastern parallel with the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Etemeneke is likely the inspiration for this particular story, and it shares the same location, Babylon. And in this story, there was this massive tower known as the ziggurat, and it was dedicated to the god Marduk of Babylon. And ziggurats were these structures that were designed to provide stairways from the heavens, the gate of the gods, to the earth, so that the gods could come down into their temple and into the town and bring blessing with them. It was a convenience that the people provided to the gods and God's messengers. And we find this type of stairway featured in some of the other mythology of the Sumerians, and also portrayed in Jacob's dream with Jacob's ladder, Genesis chapter 28, verse 12. The ziggurats were constructed of sun-dried brick frame filled with dirt and rubble and finished off with the shell of kin-baked brick. There were no rooms, there were no chambers or passageways of any sort. The structure itself was simply made to hold up this stairway, and at the top of the small room, there was space for the deity, and it was equipped with a bed and a table and supplied regularly with food by the priests. In this way, the gods could refresh themselves during their descent into the realm of the people. Then there was the Sumerian myth, dated near 21st century BCE, and this is the closest known myth that we have to the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages. And that story is called Enmaker and the Lord of Arata, the Lord of Arata. King Enmaker was the legendary king of Uruk, and there was this attempt to build this large temple to the gods. But the gods came down and confused the language of the people so they couldn't understand each other. And let me offer a paraphrase quote from that myth. In those days, the whole universe, the people in unison, Enki, the god, changed the speech in their mouths and brought contention to it. When you're reading the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, this is satire. This is a critique of Babylon, which was the historical and geographical setting of the story. And the story of the Tower of Babel is simply the Israelites, the writers, the biblical writers' engagement and subversion of the Babylonian traditions and these monumental architecture and this imperial pride that Babylon had, and their claim to be the mediators, the true mediators between heaven and earth. And this critique comes across a little bit subtly. It portrays this people that are unified by tradition and identity and ambition and empire to make a name for themselves apart from God. To show that empire building and human pride only lead to fragmentation of society in the end. It doesn't actually produce what they hope it's going to produce, which is genuine unity. Because the strength of any nation lies in its diversity. not this manufactured conformity. And so there are some themes here in Genesis chapter 11 that you find in some of these ancient Near Eastern mythopoeic texts. Let us make a name for ourselves apart from God, lest we be scattered. There was this fear of diversity and fear of being decentralized and destabilized by the presence of those who did not share their language and did not share their culture. So they spoke one language. Everybody spoke the same thing. This was a symbol of uniformity, not unity. This is a group of people who tried to control identity and speech. And they centralized power and control among those who already held positions of power and control. And the result is this forced conformity resulted in the exclusion of everybody else in society. And in such a homogeneous society where diversity is not encouraged or allowed to flourish, the neighbor that they are called to love becomes a rival, becomes somebody to oppress, somebody to marginalize. And it's the same predicament that we discovered in the Garden of Eden. What appears to be good, what appears to be decent and desirable and healthy for the people, ambition, ingenuity, the ability to ascend to the realm of the gods so that you and your ideas become the most important person and theme in the room, not making a name for yourself so that you no longer need to trust God. Build relationships and communion with your neighbor. Ultimately, that ends in destruction and fragmentation in society. All of these unified efforts were causing mischief, and God, just like a loving parent does with any children who misbehave, he separates them and puts a stop to this harmful behavior. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with making a name for yourself, right? God promised to do that with Abraham. I will make your name great. There was nothing wrong with a community of people who spoke the same language. There was nothing wrong with building a massive building. Remember, the Israelites built the temple. They had Solomon's temple, and then they had the second temple built by Zerubbabel under the leadership of Ezra. To be clear, human ambition and ingenuity and language and building, those are not the things that are on trial in Genesis chapter 11. The problem with the story of Babel was their attempt to seize with pride what can only be received by grace. They wanted to build a structure. They wanted sameness, so they all spoke the same language. They wanted immortality and the ability to control identity as a country. Let us make a name for ourselves. And the underlying fears in this story are reminiscent in the latent fears of the Garden of Eden. We're going to exchange trusting in God and God's boundaries and God's presence to becoming our own little gods, ascending to the realm of the gods. They wanted certainty through self-determined categories of good and evil. And what happens? God scatters them. And we don't need to review this as a form of punishment per se. We can look at the story of the Tower of Babel as a mercy. As the scattering and confusion created this new posture where they would have to trust instead of dominate and control. In mercy, God freed them from the illusion of being in control of anything at all. In mercy, God shows them that diversity is not a breakdown of God's plan. Diversity is the plan. Diversity has always been embedded in the creation story. You had land and sea, right? You had night and day. You had male and female, different types of species that populated the earth. Diversity is not the antithesis to God's plan. It is the plan. But at Babel, they tried to create their own kingdom and define their own reality and control speech and control identity and to ascend into the realm of the gods so that they could be equal with God. And this posture turns their neighbor, who might be different from them, into a rival and somebody to oppress and marginalize instead of love. But you find this completely reversed on the day of Pentecost. On the day of Pentecost, it's not the people ascending, it is God coming down in the person of the Holy Spirit and filling those who are gathered there, praying and waiting and longing for the promise of the Father. And God fills them with the Spirit and then speaks through them in a way that creates unity in and through diversity. God has never been threatened by diversity. It is not a plan B. It's always been the plan. God didn't erase the cultural differences at Pentecost. He worked in and through them. And through Jesus, he tears down the wall of hostility that separates people and creates in himself one new humanity out of the two, making peace. That's what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse number 14. Peace comes in and through Jesus, not a forced conformity to a handful of people who happen to be in power at the top, deciding for the rest of the world the way things ought to be and what identity ought to look like and who ought to be able to speak what. This is one reason, folks, and if you haven't caught on, this is one reason why Christian nationalism is such an insidious evil. Because which of the 46,000 different splinter groups get to define for the rest of society? Which identity? Which type of speech? How is this going to look? It appears to be good because we're Christians and we love Jesus, and why wouldn't we want this, right? It appears to be desirable. But ultimately, the most prevailing version of that paradigm that is being presented to us today, I hate to tell you this, is rooted in misogyny and racism and homophobia. That's not the kind of world I want to live in. And if 2,000 years of history has shown us anything, it's that the church cannot be trusted with that kind of power. Pentecost doesn't undo Babel, reverting to one language. Pentecost transcends Babel. Not through uniformity, but a spirit-filled communion across our human differences. What Babel fractured through control and self-elevation, Pentecost heals through self-giving love and divine initiative. True unity makes space for diversity. Communion doesn't dissolve human differences or erase boundaries. After people from many nations heard the wonderful works of God in their own language. And they followed Jesus, we're told in the book of Acts, and they continued daily together in prayer, sharing meals and sharing all things in common. Ultimately, the forced conformity and the manufactured unity established at Babel just caused society to fragment and carried the potential to suppress and oppress people, because the only people in Babylon who were able to ascend to the top were the priests. Everybody else would always be kept from ever ascending and moving up. But what we find at the foot of the cross, what we find in Jesus, is that the unity brought about by the Spirit of God was inclusive and honored diversity and created the opportunity for everybody to have equal footing at the cross of Jesus. This is why Paul can say, there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female, slave nor free, for all are one in Christ Jesus. So when you think about the scattering and the confusion of languages at Babel, this is intended to strip away the illusion that people have of being able to define reality on their terms and bring us all back to a place of trust instead of power grabs, domination, and self-reliance. God scattering the people and confusing their language was a protective measure against the collective tyranny of the powerful. Babel shows us what happens when society has this craving for certainty and sameness and control, when it overrides our calling as people to receive and trust and commune and love our neighbor and love God. Just like in Eden, the grasp for godlike power breaks connection with God and it breaks connection with each other. And so what we find here in Genesis 11 is, instead of receiving their identity from God, they try and construct their own identity through empire, through monuments, and control. Yesterday, I had just an amazing day. And I started my day early in the morning. I think I was up at 3:30. I met my son at his house at 5 a.m. and we went for a weighted ruck march, a weighted ruck hike at Greenfelder Park in Eureka. We went 6 miles. Mile 3 was brutal. It was a steep climb, and then the descent was really rough on my knees, and you're slipping around quite a bit. We're training because we're going to do a half marathon weighted ruck march next month, and so we're trying to familiarize ourselves with the territory. But I got to see my grandkids and my daughter-in-law, and then I got to spend the day shopping with my wife and my oldest daughter for her birthday. We didn't get to see her on her actual birthday, so we made arrangements to go yesterday. And I just happened to finish up in time where Nora says, well, do you want to go with us? And I said, well, as long as nobody minds me going along. She said, well, you can be our bag carrier and our bodyguard. And so my role yesterday was I carried the bags and I was the bodyguard. And it is a natural thing for me to do because my entire adult life has been spent protecting people. And so any room I go into, I'm scanning the room. I'm scanning the people. I'm paying attention for threats, and I'm prepared to engage if I have to. It's my training. It's in my nature. 53 years of ginger rage has prepared me for this moment. And we met and saw all kinds of wonderful people, as you can imagine. One young lady really stood out to me. And I won't mention the name of the store in case this happens to go viral. I don't want them catching any flack. But we were in this store, and I'm scanning everybody around the room, and I'm looking around, and I'm trying to see, if there is a threat here at all. And I noticed that the cashiers behind the register, all of them had name tags on. But this one young lady's name tag was different from everybody else's. Her name tag just read, I belong. And my initial thought, because this is how my brain works, my initial thought is, wow, what a beautiful name. How amazing that her parents had the foresight to name her I belong. That's like God naming Abraham's first son Isaac so that anytime somebody called out to Isaac, they would remember the day that Abraham laughed at God's face, right? Because Isaac means laughter. So I thought, how amazing her parents thought to name her I belong. Because anytime anybody ever called out to her name, they would be reminded that she does indeed belong anywhere she happens to be. She has the right to live, exist, thrive, flourish, and love who she wants to love. Well, as I got closer, I realized that that wasn't her name after all. It was a statement. Because underneath the phrase, I belong, was the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, all of a sudden, she was the most courageous person in the room to me. I was so proud and my heart filled with so much joy standing next to somebody who could stand there and say, I belong. I made sure I told her how much I loved her button, and I smiled at her as a way of acknowledging and affirming her. You know what I concluded in my scan of that room? This lady wearing a name tag that says, I belong, she was not a threat to my life. She wasn't a threat to my family. She wasn't a threat to my faith. She wasn't a threat to my country. She's not a threat to my income. And I'll not be a threat to her. I'll not be a threat to her either. My day improved because I had the opportunity to meet and stand near a fellow human made in the image of God, not my image, somebody else who belonged. This idea of sameness and uniformity, that only feels safe for people in power. Diversity is safer for the people. God scattering the people at Babel was divine protection against the consolidated tyranny of the powerful. And what that did is it allowed the freedom for humanity to discover truth without one empire defining what that is supposed to look like and sound like. Babel wasn't just a structure, it was a statement. We can ascend to the realm of gods on our terms. We don't need or want anybody outside of our circle. And God in mercy just dismantles this empire built on human pride and godlike ambition to ensure that we all can live in a world of possibility where relationships with people who are different from us can be built on trust and respect. Babel only appeared to be peaceful and safe and harmonious, but just like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it only offered illusory promises while poisoning the very thing it was meant to protect. Diversity is not the sin to avoid. Rejection of difference, whether it's in Babel, Eden, or America, in favor of this insulated, self-reliant system kills the image of God in you and in your neighbor. Babel is what idolatry looks like when people exchange control and exclusion and power for freedom, inclusion, and love.